Hey folks, and welcome to our penultimate video in this Gaming Through Sporting History series, where we're looking at uh, Championship Manager 2010 and how it's represented the last 15 years of global footballing history, sort of, and why. And today we're looking at German football. We're looking at the Bundesliga, and then in the last video we're looking at um, Ligue 1 and Serie A, so the French and Italian leagues. But here we're looking at the Bundesliga, which, as we're all pretty aware, has been dominated by Bayern Munich. I mean, Bayern Munich have been a prominent force in German and European football for many, many years. But this last 15 years has seen them monopolize almost uh, the Bundesliga. 12 of 15 titles. Borussia Dortmund have picked up two titles, and Bayer Leverkusen, or Leverkusen as they have been known, going unbeaten in 2023-2024 to finally break their particular duck. But yeah, very much an outlier there in a league that has become dominated by that one team. And how has that been reflected in the game? Well, to be honest, it's a very similar spread to what we saw with the English Premier League. Teams do seem to struggle to establish themselves at the top and remain at the top. I think that is partly to do with how the computer does squad management. And this is something we've discussed in a couple of videos, the extent to which the game has proven to be quite good in effectively um, assessing the quality of sides going into the game. So teams that are very good in 2008, 2009, 2010, they have a pretty good rating in 2010, and they do sort of stay at the top from 2010. But in terms of squad and team development, um, they struggle to stay there. And I think that is partly to do with how the finances and how the squad management of the game plays out. We saw with the careers of even Ronaldo and Messi that the computer is quite willing and able to sell very talented players, so lose high quality players. Does the computer replace them effectively? Question mark. And then, in Ronaldo's case, we did see that he moved to a couple of teams and then didn't play much. So again, are they using elite players to the best of their ability? I think quite early on in the game, the computer is very willing to sell players that perhaps are not in the first team and not replace them effectively enough. So teams that go into the game with high quality first team players and a deep squad can very quickly find themselves not having so many of those elite players and not having the depth of the squad. And it kind of just evens the playing field quite a lot. I mean, with Spain, we did see that Real Madrid and Barcelona maintained a certain degree of dominance, but certainly in the Premier League and certainly in the Bundesliga, it's not really played out that way. Bayern Munich do come out with the most titles. They claim 13 of 45, so only 29% of all titles, but then it's a very even spread below that. And this will probably be quite painful for some German football fans out there, but Schalke, Hertha Berlin, I mean, they do very well. Borussia Dortmund, they pick up 5 titles. Leverkusen win once, so they do claim a title, but it's far from the regularity to see them sort of emerge as any kind of challenger. And really, Bayern Munich, they have that more consistent success than other teams, but they aren't miles away. I mean, certainly in no way are they near the vast majority of titles going in that direction as we've seen in the real world. So in terms of then an overall theme, in terms of die Bayern march on, not really the case. And when we look into the individual case studies, it's interesting to see which teams emerge as challengers. And again, it goes to that point that teams that started out, when the game is being developed in 2008, 2009, you know, certain teams certainly were showing signs of becoming quality teams, and I think that is Can be true of the teams that come on to challenge. So Schalke, was a team on the rise throughout the early 2000s, but financial collapse hit following the global pandemic, and the team was relegated from the Bundesliga at the end of the 2021 season. Hertha Berlin spent most of the period as a mid-table side in the Bundesliga, but was relegated at the end of 2024 season. So, these are two teams that in real life have had quite stark falls from grace and don't even find themselves in the Bundesliga at this point in time. And why is that? Well, I think for Schalke, unfortunately, it is a combination of, financial and off-field issues. Obviously, the game isn't going to model a global pandemic, thankfully, that leads to, massive decreases in revenues for teams that kind of rely on that match day spend. Um, and this is a particular issue, perhaps within German football. You have the sort of majority fan ownership. You kind of got a lot of schemes in place that should make it a more even playing field. But Bayern Munich have basically been able to sort of like break that model and establish a degree of dominance. But below them, the competition is quite wild. So we have a lot of very prominent teams currently, Hamburg, etc., who find themselves not in Schalke, Hertha Berlin, Hamburg, find themselves no longer in the Bundesliga, and teams that, can rise from relative obscurity. Obviously, RB Leipzig have a particular story that is controversial in its own right. But below Bayern Munich, there is a great deal of fluctuation and competition within the Bundesliga. And I suppose to that extent, the game has somewhat modelled that being the case, but just Bayern Munich being a little bit closer to that march than being that sort of step away that they've been over the past 15 years. Now, the second thing is, and we've sort of looked at this in various guises, but I thought I'd connect what has been sort of the underperformance of German teams that we saw in continental competition, the underperformance of German teams domestically in terms of the prominence of particular teams, to also the under underperformance of the German national team. So, I mean, this is something that's a little hard to quantify. But anyway, I mean, in terms of context, so prior to the 2010 season, the German national team was one of the world's most successful sides, having won 3 World Cups and 3 European Championships. In 2014, Germany wins the World Cup in Brazil with a 1-0 extra time victory over Argentina. However, since 2010, the team has not reached a European Championships final and failed to qualify for the knockout stages of the 2018 and 2022 World Cups. So obviously this has led to quite a lot of soul searching and head scratching really in sort of German domestic and national setup. Why has that persistent quality and competitiveness at international level sort of vanished from the national side? Can that be a function of Bayern's dominance and perhaps a falling of average quality as too much talent gets concentrated in particular areas? I don't know. Could the game even model that? But what is the case with the Bundesliga is it does underperform. It certainly underperforms in continental competition, and it underperforms in international competition. Across all of the playthroughs, Germany only reaches 2 finals and wins neither of them. So in a way, it is very in line with, hence the A. I mean, it's very in line with the real world performance. Germany, as an international side, has had a pretty barren run of it of late. And it's even more barren in the game than it is in real life. Germany has a World Cup during this period, which is obviously an immense achievement. But, that's over a decade ago now. And the performance in major tournaments has been pretty poor, not even exiting the group stages of European Championships. And yeah, very much reflected in the real world. Why does that happen in the game as well? Does the game have some insight into systemic issues within German football and player development? It's a big curiosity. I don't know why that would be the case. I mean, if we were to play more playthroughs, would there be any one particular? I mean, what we did see in the international competition is that, a few teams were consistent, and below that was a great deal of inconsistency. Certainly from Europe, you had more consistent success from England, than has been expressed in the real world. Internationally, Brazil, Argentina, very prominent teams. Um, so certainly some teams have overperformed, some have underperformed, but with Germany there is a general underperformance in all levels, which which is clearly disappointing for the Bundesliga fans, but obviously, something for the player to perhaps push against. The thing is, there just doesn't really seem to be, in my mind, any sort of mechanical gameplay process which should lead to this level of underperformance. After all, there are elite players in Germany and with Germany at the outset of the game. Germany should be a competitive force from the outset, and over 15 years, those high-performing German teams without any of the pandemic and other financial issues being modeled in, should be able to build successful campaigns. But it just doesn't happen, which is reflective of real life, but is equally as baffling. So finally, yeah, looking at sort of individual performances, when we look at the Bundesliga, the story of success in the Bundesliga has also been the story of the rise of Robert the Body Lewandowski. And this is another, fun, it's really fun to follow these individual careers and see if at all possible, how close they got to their sort of real world successes. Because in 2010, Robert Lewandowski is making his name at Lech Poznan in his native Poland. He had moved to Borussia Dortmund in 2010, claiming 2 league titles, before moving to Bayern Munich and claiming a further 8 league titles, as well as the Champions League in 2019-2020, scoring 15 goals in 10 games during the campaign. So just a phenomenal player. Obviously nowadays he finds himself at Barcelona doing equally wonderful things. But yeah, he's a talented youngster, but he's obviously yet to move to Borussia Dortmund. So his career is very much at that sort of pivotal turning point stage of, how does he go from being a talented youngster in a relatively obscure market in Poland to establish himself as an elite player on the world stage. Um, and yeah, I mean, 10 of the 15 league titles, the Bundesliga titles for the period, go to teams. Go to teams including this man, and then he moves on, of course. So he could well have played more. But yeah, an immense player with an immense footprint on the Bundesliga over this 10 to 15-year period. So how did he get on in the game? Well, the answer, unsurprisingly, is not as well. Not as well. Now, let's look at his 3 different careers. So in the first one, he stays at Lech Poznan for much of his career, winning 3 league titles and moves to Danish side AaB Aalborg in 2020. In the second, wins 2 titles with Lech Poznan before moving to Toulouse in 2013 and then Sevilla in 2020. And then he wins 2 league titles with Lech Poznan before moving to Bayer Leverkusen in 2012 and then Real Betis in 2015. Bit of a typo there. So yes, I mean, similar overall trajectories of his career. Again, I think a player that doesn't get to the elite level, very similar really to what we saw with Fred Adu and Neymar. A quality player, decent amount of output, very loyal, doesn't move around quite as much, but does not get really anywhere close to the elite level. And then we look at his numbers. Well, looking in the IRL, like these are phenomenal numbers. 152 international caps, 83 goals. His goals per game, 0.75, assists per game, 195. So averaging just shy of a goal involvement every single game. Obviously, how these numbers are professed in game, we've seen before. They're not as robust, I suppose, as you might like. But again, it just gives us some metrics by which to compare like for like in terms of real world and in-game performance, and then compare how our real world players perform against each other versus the in-game. But anyway, 99 caps, 35 goals average across the three, the rating of 6.46. I mean, we've seen with the better players in the game having an average of basically 6.5, 6.6 is a good average. So he's just short of that. His goals per game, 0.3, assists are down, and his overall contributions are, nudging 0.4. So again, a good career, but far from a great career, and that's very much reflected in the teams he plays for and his overall output. So yeah, a Lech Poznan and Poland legend with approaching 100 caps and a decent amount of goals, but he does not reach the top. Like, he is in no way as good as our real world Lewandowski. Why might that be? Well, again, accurately predicting how any emerging talent is going to play out is pretty wild. But he's certainly a player that, had he been acquired by an elite team, I think you probably would have said the same for Freddie Adu and Neymar, he would have produced far better numbers, and had that prominent career. But he's not. He's just not. Then maybe that asks questions about how the game does scouting. Certainly you look at his statistics, throughout the game, and he's a player that could certainly do a job at a Real Madrid or a Barcelona. Those teams that show consistent success at the top in our playthroughs, but doesn't reach there. Doesn't reach there. Plays in Denmark, plays a bit in France, Sevilla, Real Betis. So ends up in Andalusia. Has a lovely career in some beautiful places. But yes, far from the elite player that we see in the real world. So from there, I thought, well, let's broaden our horizons to look at other elite players and see how their how their careers play out. And in particular, wonder kids that we know are kind of established in the game, but things that don't quite work out. So we've looked at players that are at the top and perhaps underachieve, Lewandowski and Neymar, and we're also looking at players that have that wonder kid status and how do they compare in the real world. So the two that I picked out, Jack Wilshere and Mario Balotelli. Now, in terms of starting points, so we're going back to 2010, and Jack Wilshere was beginning to establish himself as a first-team regular at Arsenal. However, injuries blighted his progress. After leaving Arsenal and failing to settle at a number of clubs, he retired from football in 2022, aged just 30. So this really is a story of what might have been there for Jack Wilshere. Very talented footballer. 2010, he's still a teenager, but he is establishing himself as a first-team regular at Arsenal, and he has a very bright career ahead of him. But it is injuries that largely put pay to his reaching the very top and staying at the very top. And yes, he's retired from football before when he could well have been at the peak of his powers. And then down below, well, Super Mario. What an interesting guy, what a talent. But yes, in 2010, Mario Balotelli was beginning to establish himself as first-team regular at Inter Milan. So you've got two players, again, much like Neymar and Adu. There's a similar place in 2010, but how did they end up? He would win 3 league titles with Inter Milan before moving to Man City and claiming another league title. He would then move on to a number of clubs, with his career would be dogged by criticisms of his attitude and inconsistency. Now, this is an interesting comparison, because, of course, the game models injury, and obviously quite severe injuries. So players can certainly have their careers sabotaged by absence due to injury. Obviously, that's unlikely to be underlying, modeled for Jack Wilshere, but it can be modeled for certain players, just their susceptibility to injury over the course of their career. So this is very much, what would have happened had Jack Wilshere not suffered so many injuries, perhaps. Whereas for Mario, it's more of his own making, because injuries haven't really been his issue. His issue has kind of been his reputation and perceptions of his work rate and contributions to a certain extent by his off-field shenanigans. But both players that are establishing themselves at the elite level at this point and whose careers go in similar-ish paths, but for very different reasons. And the game, in the case of Mario, doesn't really model that sort of off-field complications and sort of complicated behaviors and how they result, how they interact with on-field performance. So let's just see how they get on. So yes, play through one. Signs for Arsenal, signs for Liverpool from Arsenal in 2017, but only stays for one season before moving to Barcelona. Wins the World Cup with England in 2022. Moves from Arsenal to Chelsea in 2016. Or returning to Arsenal in 2012. Wins the Euros with England in 2016, and finally spends 2010 to 2013 seasons on loan, twice at Burnley, once at Blackburn. Remains at Arsenal before moving to Barcelona in 2019, when he scores the winner in the Champions League final. And this makes for some sad reading, I think, for fans of Jack Wilshere, because what might have been, and when we're talking about Neymar and Adu and Lewandowski, I mean, these are very talented youngsters coming through, but we kind of say that they don't hit the elite level because they aren't playing for these, really significant teams, and obviously notably Barcelona, who hoover up a lot of great talent because of that success and the continued financial power that brings. But yeah, certainly if you're playing at Barcelona, that is the elite level that Adu, largely playing at Wolves, Neymar playing all over the shop, including sort of Newcastle or, staying at Santos, and Lewandowski largely playing in Poland and other sort of mid-level teams, doesn't really achieve. But here is Jack Wilshere staying at Arsenal, proving successful, and then moving to elite teams, Barcelona, Chelsea, and having great success, winning international competitions with England and winning Champions Leagues with Barcelona. What might have been. Over to Super Mario. So in the first, he also signs for Barcelona. So again, these guys hit the elite level and they hit it early. He signs for Barcelona from Inter Milan in 2011 and remains for the majority of his career before moving to Manchester United in 2022. In the second playthrough, signs for Liverpool from Inter Milan in 2010, but fails to establish himself. Moves to Lyon in 2013, winning the Champions League in 2017, before moving to Newcastle United late on his career in 2023. And in the third playthrough, he's loaned to Real Madrid from Inter Milan in 2011, scores 40 goals in Serie A season with Inter Milan in 2014, before moving to Barcelona in 2015, wins the Euros with Italy in 2016, but sees playing time reduce after the 2023 season. So a bit more choppy and changey there for Super Mario, if you like, but again, it hits the elite level and stays there. Barcelona, certainly elite. Winning, you're going to win a lot with Barcelona. You're going to be one of the most, notable players of the generation if you're playing for that club, as we've seen with their sort of domestic and international and continental success. But also Lyon. We've seen how successful French teams are in continental competition, and obviously we're going to be talking about Liga in the next video. But Lyon is one of those elite teams, definitely one of those European elite teams. So for both of these players, they do go up to a level that with the other players we've looked at, they simply don't get there. So these two, without having injuries and without having off-field issues modelled in the game, they do have stellar careers and are amongst the better players of this generation. So look, if we get into some of those numbers. So international performance, much of a muchness. Balotelli, a prominent attacker, 72 caps, averaging out over the three players, 72 caps and 30 goals. Wilshere, 78 and 13. Rating, again, we're kind of saying if you're, 6.6 is sort of elite. So Wilshere just a touch below there, 6.55. Balotelli certainly up, 6.68. And then in terms of contributions, well, obviously the position matters. Balotelli is in the game, he's an FRLC, so he's a forward that can play anywhere, right, left, centre, which is interesting. Like he's not an SC, the striker centre, the primary goal scorer, let's say. So he can be played on the wings and across the front, but he's certainly played wherever he is in a goal scoring position. And, that's borne out by his average goals per game, which, as we've seen with other players, is actually very good. Like he's not prolific in this sense, but in a real world sense, let's say. But he's averaging, almost a goal every 2 games, which is a good outcome in the game. Assists obviously down because he's more of a scorer than a provider. For Wilshere, some of those numbers do actually seem pretty low. He's a attacking midfielder in the game, and again, RLC, so he can play across the attacking positions. Not a forward, but an attacking midfielder, so he can play in a broad range of positions in that midfield, but orientated more to attack than he was necessarily in the real world, where he's a touch more on the defensive. But yeah, goals per game and assists, not the hottest, but comparatively speaking, compared to their real world output, given the relatively short amount of time that Wilshere spent at the elite level and Balotelli's rather inconsistent performances, strong numbers shown by them in the game. So what we're going to do here is then draw on these 5 individual stories and see how they play out. So this is the IRL performance. So obviously we've got Adu across to Wilshere, and I think it's fair to say that Lewandowski and Neymar are obviously the 2 most prominent talents there in terms of their real world output, both in terms of internationally and domestically. They are, they have the most successful careers. Balotelli, strong, but disappointing output there for sure. I mean, caps just at 36. But look at Wilshere. It's quite interesting that despite the short, he had 34 caps. Again, what might have been? He'd already picked up 34 caps despite all of his issues with injuries. I mean, he would still be a prominent player, I would expect, with England now. A well-capped and entrenched talent at international level. So again, what might have been, but yeah, that output, really down there for Wilshere. Goals and assists, 0.04, 0.08, so a long way off what we've seen even in game. So comparing that, how do we rank it? Well, look, Balotelli's got to come out on top. Look at those numbers. Look at those numbers. So I've highlighted, this is the in-game performance then, so I've highlighted the top performer. So Freddie Adu comes out on top in terms of caps. 144 caps for Freddie Adu. So, certainly a household name. A player who's picked up approaching 150 caps for a nation is going to be a household name. Again, I don't think we're in GOAT territory, but certainly a household name. In terms of international goals, well, Lewandowski actually comes out on top. So again, household name and Poland legend, but he's not necessarily going to be in the GOAT conversation. And that's because of those numbers down below. So in terms of rating, Balotelli comes out on top with a 6.68. Then Neymar, I mean, this is the interesting thing, 6.57. So, good. A good 0.1 off Balotelli, so lacking that consistency. But again, striking that of these players who were all elite wonder kids at the outset of the game, Neymar has the second highest average score for the period, but doesn't really play at the elite level and doesn't have that prominent international career. So again, in terms of scouting and acquisition, yeah, question marks really about how the computer really deals with these talented players. In terms of rating, Wilshere's in there at third with 6.55. Then you got quite a handy drop off to Lewandowski, 6.46, and then Adu at the bottom of 6.36. So kind of pointing to the fact that in this world, in this digital world, Freddie Adu and Lewandowski are certainly well-known players and local legends, but they're far from the international talents. And I think you'd say the same for Neymar, simply because he hasn't played at those elite clubs. He hasn't had that prominent international career. Wilshere, I think you'd put him into second place because he has played at the elite level. He's been at Barcelona. He's going to have won many La Liga titles and Champions League titles. Like, he is a very prominent talent. I mean, I suppose, I'd put him in, I don't know, what sort of player might you compare him to? Of the current, Barcelona ilk, you'd put him alongside, you know, Iniesta, maybe. You'd put him alongside a Xavi, probably playing a similar kind of role. And, certainly, legendary status for a player that had that sort of longevity at the highest level. But then, when we get into the other numbers, Balotelli just surges ahead. Goals per game, assists per game, and then obviously the combined goals and assists, goal contributions, he's way out in front on every single metric. But the goals per game, it's interesting that, again, Neymar doesn't go anywhere near the elite level, but he has the second highest goals per game by a handy margin, 0.384. Then you got the drop off to Lewandowski, 3.29. And then Adu and Wilshere, seem to play in far more, deep playing creative roles, perhaps, but don't have the prominence in terms of goals scored. But assists as well. This is the thing. Like, Balotelli is a creator as well as a scorer. He has the highest assists per game of all those players. That's certainly where Wilshere seems to sneak into second place there as well with a 0.04. I mean, low numbers, admittedly, but he's ahead of the other players in this sort of peer group in terms of goal assists. So, goal contributions there. So again, you're going to put Balotelli number 1. I'm going to put Wilshere number 2. I'm going to put Lewandowski number 3, largely because of his more significant international career. Neymar would be, sort of 4, 3, third equal 4 because of his undoubted qualities in terms of domestic football, but he hasn't had the impact either by playing at the elite level, at club level, or that consistent international career. So I think he's sort of a third equal /4. And Freddie Adu, certainly a prominent player for the period and a well-known name, but because of that international career, but he's certainly played at a lower level than the others. You can tell that by his rating and overall stats, that he doesn't emerge as that generational talent that we might have expected. So, guys, overall, I think when we're looking at the Bundesliga, we're again in kind of B territory, aren't we? We're in B territory. A solid simulation in terms of the league overall, a solid simulation where Bayern Munich do maintain a certain level of elevated success over their peers, but certainly don't dominate to the same extent. Oddly enough, the modelling of the international team is remarkably accurate, and I really don't know why. But Germany's international team seemed to underperform in Championship Manager 2010 to a similar extent to the extent to which they don't perform internationally in the real world over this period. But then when we're getting into those talents, again, kind of the trajectories of players is pretty wild. But, given that they're trying to model many different underlying factors, it's understandable to see that these 5 players we're looking here as a sort of a cohort example of wonder kids have quite different trajectories to their real world counterparts. But it's interesting that, to look at it for each of them, it's kind of off-field matters that aren't modeled in game that probably have the greater impact in how their different plans, how their different careers have panned out. Obviously, for Freddie Adu, things happened, whether the pressure got to him or whatever it might be, he simply didn't live up to the wonder kid status. For Mario Balotelli, perhaps it's the off-field, attitude issues that aren't modelled. For Lewandowski, flipping it, he's clearly a very motivated and ambitious and, physically powerful individual that perhaps pushed him to a level he didn't achieve in game. With Neymar, the move to Barcelona, obviously, makes his career and he doesn't make that leap to the elite level. If in the game he's acquired early on by Barcelona, he may well have had the absolutely storming career that would be more aligned to his real world self, but he simply doesn't have the luck or the self-publish the sort of self-publication or whatever to get himself on the books at a prominent team. And obviously for Jack Wilshere, it's injuries. So there's a lot off the pitch that isn't really modelled in game that influences how these players' careers play out. But it is quite stark to see the differences if perhaps the game puts these players on a level playing field where it's simply their on-field abilities that come through, the extent to which Super Mario rises to the top. Anyway, thanks very much, guys. Last video coming up where we wrap things up looking at Syria and Liga. Ciao for now.